Yo, yo, yo. It's Mike Sauter and my compadre, my Goomba, Michael Martin again for this week's Regeneration podcast. We're joined again with our good friend Thieke, and quite often when I see the mug of my friend Michael, I think of asking him about how things are going on his farm. But this week there was a news item, and I'll assure people we have not talked about this, but it's something that drove me kind of nuts. There was this stinking images from the James Webb Telescope. Did you guys see those?
Yes,
I did.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to them? They drive me nuts, and I can try to explain, but I don't know if I'm right, but I have a viscerally negative reaction.
Well, I saw a really funny meme that showed those clear images from outer space and showed a security camera. It's all fuzzy. You can't see what the guy looks like. They can do that, huh?
Yeah.
So,
Tara?
it feels a little audacious.
Yeah. Say more.
When you see that people have added colors and touch them up around the edges, that makes me feel frustrated. Like I would like to see.
It's like TikTok.
I would like to see it as unadulterated as possible.
I agree. I think that hit it on the head. I was thinking because you were joining us, Tara, and we have a different subject, folks, that we'll jump into, but it was Front Porch Republic. We've referenced that a number of times on the show. And they had a nice short little article by an author, Casey Spinks, who was referencing, he'd rather see the stars without light pollution than have to receive these images. Exactly. But though I write for Front Porch a lot, I've probably commented on 4 articles ever, but I commented on Casey's because it was the thing you were getting at, Tara, that this notion I feel like we're all being kind of channeled into some type of spectacle that's supposed to bring us all together, but they're highly adulterated, right? The infrared and the ultraviolet, we can't see with our eyes. All the images, it seems to me, it's just data collected as numbers turned into an image, and they apply colors to them. And they're so adulterated, and it's nothing the human eye would ever see if it was out there. And they say, we think this is what the human eye would see if you're out there. And all that language, ever since I was a kid, just drives me nuts.
Well, it feels very, we're supposed to be in an anti-colonialism age, but it feels very Western colonialism in terms of how it disregards indigenous knowledge of the stars. I don't know if you're familiar with the Dogon people in Nigeria.
No.
But they told anthropologists in the 1920s that Sirius A had a twin star, Sirius B, and they traced out all the map of it. And they said, not only that, there's also a Sirius C. And anthropologists were like, well, Sirius C doesn't exist. They just made that up. Uh-huh. And Sirius B, they must have read a newspaper because we only just discovered it. And we've recently discovered there probably is a Sirius C in that system. So all those ancient ways of looking at the stars are completely disregarded. The Dogon people are presenting an incredible mystery to astrophysical knowledge. Yeah. And yet we're just like, oh, we don't want to know about it. We just want to take our fancy pictures, which, like you said, are just made out of numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know some of the ones at the microscopic level are definitely made out of numbers. I could be wrong, but I know it's like 12.5 hours. There's all these different images that they kind of collate, and then they thwap some colors on them. And again, colors outside of our visible range. And I think we're kind of stumped, or we're amused to death in some way by them. Then the president, when the world's kind of in a piecemeal, to quote Pope Francis, like moving piecemeal into World War III, President Biden gets to deliver these images, and we all kind of congratulate ourselves on something called science. And I think, I've done a lot, like if you go out to the end of the universe or down to the smallest Planck length, it doesn't really matter for me. We tend to favor one more than the other. But I always think, go down, get smaller, because at least when you're blowing up rockets, you're not like spending all this jet fuel and polluting the rivers around Cape Canaveral and things like that. And again, I don't know, women would also see this. It's just some wild male thing. I would
Yeah,
think, out of-
don't even get me talking about what's his name, Jeff Bezos' rocket ship
Yeah,
and Sigmund Freud. Yeah,
it's for
I
real.
could do a
It's-
whole thing right here. Well,
Talk
yeah,
about-
that's
Yeah, go ahead.
that's a, that's a dude thing, right?
It is a dude thing.
We're conquering. I'm gonna go conquer some stuff.
Yeah.
Really. But there's another star there, right? No, you don't have science. You know what I mean?
Does it have to be a dude thing? Like all those ancient stone circles, which seem to have some embedded memory of the stars.
No, it's a dude thing to colonialism, right? To colonize.
That's the big part.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's use science and tech and colonialism and things like that to kind of segue to our topic du jour. And it's one of the reasons we welcomed back our friend, a very good friend, polymath and wonderful conversationalist, Tara Thieke. How are you today, Tara?
I'm doing wonderful. You know, I get a few hours each day in the early morning to do my researches before I get into life. And it's a wonderful parallel every day, that rhythm of here's my intellectual abstract activity, and now here's raising the kids. And
it's great. I think we're going to bring them together. And we talked for maybe 20 seconds before we started this podcast. But let me say podcast in case we haven't made it clear. Anybody who's listening to us on a podcast, know that we're also on YouTube at the Regeneration channel. And the same thing, if you're first seeing us on YouTube, let us make it explicit that you can also find us if you're traveling in your car on a podcast, Spotify, all the other ones, but go to Podbean to the Regeneration podcast. But today we're here and we've invited Tara back with us, a mother of 3 children.
4.
That's right. I knew that. So sorry. Because one's so new. And in the 20 seconds we were talking before going live, she had mentioned something like nature school. So we're gonna weave that in. But today's subject is education. A couple weeks ago, Michael and I were talking about Rudolf Steiner. It's somebody we've all read, and he's just one kind of feeding stream, a very important one, into how we might talk today about education. I would say education coming out in the age of in the wake of COVID. One quote from somebody I'll bring in today, but because we were talking about science and tech, Ivan Illich, one of the phrases he used to describe the modern educational enterprise was the use of science and tech to separate people into classes of masters and slaves, right? Yeah. And so, Tara, maybe, kind of beginning with you, this is one of the smallest things you've written on, but it was a tweet, I think, before you went off Twitter for a while, and I'm so glad you're back. But again, I don't mean that in any way other than you doing you and what's right for you. But you were just, at one point, you had conjectured in a tweet, and I don't know if you even remember it, but like all these different pods that started during COVID, there was probably a lot of interesting ideas. If we could get people to talk about maybe what they learned. We know that during COVID, these stories. Well, one I was just reading, it was, I think, an author interviewed in the Economist magazine. I found him in an educational journal called The 74, Thomas Kane. He's a Harvard economist. And you say, why economists? Well, sometimes they run the best, data analysis of things. But he was just conjecturing what it would possibly what it would take, even in the schools as they are, to catch up remedially for what people lost during the lockdowns and the school closures. Maybe by the end of 2023, I think the whole next year after next year, if there was almost like full year summer school, which none of us want here, and everything, but just what that did. But let Tara, give us some leading thoughts, some kind of coming out of the age of COVID and having 4 small kids, and where you're thinking on this subject right now. Get us started.
Well, I feel very lucky because I think I've been proactive on issues of there being major problems in mainstream education that most people aren't looking at. So that's given me an ability to sort of make choices for my kids and supplement things with them that sort of make up the gap. But for other kids, like what you just said, I don't think we have 2 crises here. We have COVID and we have the crisis of what the education system is.
Mhm.
And people want to boil that down to politics and critical race theory. And, to some extent, I agree with them. But there's a larger crisis in that the educational system as a whole is just so abstracted away from daily life, from not teaching kids how to balance a checkbook to not teaching, kids in New York City how to garden. There are so many problems. And it couldn't, to try to put that on a paper and say we could catch up by 2023, what does it mean to catch up right now? We're not asking the right questions.
No.
We have a field of administrators who are leading our questions. And I think the only way progress comes is sort of the way it is coming through the critical race theory pushback, though I want that to extend like outward beyond critical race theory. Where is the food in our kids' cafeteria coming from?
Mhm.
Why are our kids in these mega classrooms? Why do we have middle school students segregated into these small little arenas where they can just feed upon each other's energy? Like, there's some big questions that need to be asked, and we're not collectively asking them yet.
Awesome. Michael.
I just want to burn the whole thing down. Well,
I don't think that's a crazy starting point.
Well, there's so many things. I have taught everything from kindergarten through elementary school, high school, college, and graduate school. So I taught the whole thing. And I've been at it for 30 years, basically. And we've homeschooled our own kids. And so I see by my, it's almost a laissez-faire kind of approach to teaching. It's more labor intensive for my wife, who does most of the homeschooling when the kids are through 7th or 8th grade. But by 7th and 8th grade, they start to become very independent and they can do a lot of things on their own. High school, I don't think she does anything with them. They basically teach themselves. And we provide a curriculum. I always tell people that my wife's runs the homeschool, but I'm the principal because I designed the curriculum. At least for the elementary school, which is basically based on a Waldorf curriculum. But I think it all comes down to, and we see this right now with what's going on with not just critical race theory, but the bizarre phenomenon of drag queen story hour and all that kind of sexual grooming that's going on as well. Which the good thing about COVID is a lot of parents found out what was going on at school.
I was going to say that.
You know what I mean? They're like, hold it. But I think the problem is, and this is what I really admire Rudolf Steiner about, with who started Waldorf education or came up with the curriculum, is that there's really no anthropology. There's no understanding of what a human being is. And if you don't have that to start from, it's going to be chaos. It's going to be madness. It's chaos is putting it too mildly. It'll just be insane, which is what it is. So in fact, there was a time when I was at Marygrove College prior to their closing in 2017. For a while there, I was the curriculum director for what was called the Institute for Arts Infused Education, because they hired, one of our art professors was kind of steering it, but she knew I was a Waldorf teacher who knew how to actually do arts in education. So she tagged me to help her do this. And I remember the first meeting we had, I said, well, what's your philosophy of what we're doing here? And she looked at me kind of stunned. I said, we're just going to put arts in everything. I said, no, that's not a philosophy. What do you have anything about what's age appropriate or what child development is or anything like this? And they didn't really.
Yeah.
But if you don't have and I think I was looking for it, I couldn't find it. I think Jacques Maritain wrote a book on the crisis in education. I think this is in the 1940s or early 50s, which is really brilliant. And Now talk about it. We're talking about the crisis in education right now. They were talking about it in the 40s and 50s. Steiner was taught. That's why Steiner was asked to devise Waldorf education, because they said, obviously, what we've been offering in the West for education didn't produce real human beings who would not partake in World War One. Right. That couldn't have happened in a civilized society, right? But it did. And that's why Steiner turned it up. His starting point is anthropology, is what is a human being? What is an incarnating human being? What is a child? What are the stages of childhood? How do we mark them? Right? They're not, and I think, and I've been around education for so long to know that nobody has a damn clue in higher education. And I hate it. The big joke is that in higher education, it's the people who have education doctorates who are thought of as the biggest idiots on campus. Nobody takes them seriously.
Well,
the PhDs don't take them seriously at all.
They seem to come in with a scheme of what they've learned in a classroom about the values they're supposed to impose, but there's no sense of the creature.
No.
They see, when I think about this, I hate to harp on this word, but the word equality seems to have slowly unfurled the idea that people are numbers.
Yeah,
And
it's a flattening. Yeah.
You say like, oh, well, maybe the age of the teeth signifies something. Then people are like, what? I'm not comfortable with that idea.
Yeah.
That losing your teeth and the dream world could have any effect in the classroom. And you'd have to know a kid to say, this kid lost their teeth now, and this kid hasn't lost their teeth. This kid can skip and is ready to write. This kid can't skip. Those are value judgments that they don't want to make. They want to kind of keep things equal in terms of numbers and look at the kids in the classroom as development says that all 6-year-olds should be able to write,
S. Swabat, student will be able to, right?
Exactly.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, it's horrible. I hate it.
The notion here between, that, Michael, you or Tara was talking about like expansive to begin with, that I've in my life, Illich would say that, school districts are, learning under the regime of scarcity, as if learning was a scarce thing. It might be on this podcast another time, but this guy who wrote this book, Ishmael, which was kind of a coming of age story some years ago, Daniel Quinn. I never saw Illich say it this way, but he said like early education, if you think of kindergarten, when they're teaching you things like up and down, in and out, it's using the medium of schooling, separation into grades, fluorescent lights above you, classes of way too many kids. The only thing we know about the teacher is that they've been in this crazy atmosphere longer than the kids. They may be smart, they may not, but using the whole atmosphere. And they're teaching you things like up and down, in and out. And I don't know if he used this language, but he was implying that these are things, even if you were locked in a black box, you would have to learn on your own. But they're drilling down the medium that they're convincing you learn it by being in school, right? And so the medium is the message there. So you have this notion of a pyramidal structure, grades based on alchemy, that are supposed to spew out people, and so only the winners come out. So it's not really all for all. And then you have which I've been tempted to, because I've got these kind of anarchistic impulses. But like Michael said, that at the later grades you don't have to do much at all. But I think we all try to give some shepherding. We don't see our own children as empty vessels that we have to pour in content. But, we know our kids. We might see early on that, like, why are they getting frustrated with this subject, math, when they're not learning it this way? When, for example, they love everything having to do with trains or Band-Aids or something. And that would just be a great content for them to pick up these easy things, But so we have the unschooling types, and then we have this kind of like hyper-focused weird medium. And so COVID, at least it gave a lot of people a chance to see around the corners a little bit, to see behind the curtains.
Yeah, and I think It's interesting, like we talked a couple weeks ago. Rudolf Steiner, when he devised Waldorf education, he wasn't trying to burn the whole thing down and start over. He was trying to um, upgrade the structure that was already there, and he added some things that were very innovative, like staying with the same teacher for 8 years, and the way he used, the arts are employed, and of course his anthropology. But it's interesting. I looked at, gosh, it's maybe 20 years ago now. The relics of Saint Therese of Lisieux were coming into town where I lived. We lived actually 2 miles away from the Shrine of the Little Flower in Michigan, which is a beautiful church. It's got a horrible history, but it's a beautiful church. And I really wanted to go see Saint Therese's relics before I had to go teach. I was a Waldorf teacher then, and no kidding. So I'm sleeping, and I was not good at getting up early in those days. I had little kids in the house. I was just not good at it. I was teaching in the evening too, and if I wanted to see her relics, I would have had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, okay, I'll set the alarm, but I know I'm not going to get up. But no kidding, I had a dream that Saint Therese was there, and she said, "Réveille-toi." She said, "Wake up," in French. And I woke up, and I looked at the clock, and I had time, so I got in my car, and I was like, even a mile away from the church, every parking spot was filled. And I said, "I'll never get in." I turned the corner. There's a spot right in front of the church. And so I get out, and I go in the church, and just as I go in, they're bringing her relics right in front of me. And then a few years later, my kids and I, we went to mass there, and in the narthex they had like a little museum kind of thing with the history of the church, and they had a photograph of that. And one of the kids goes, "Hey, Dad, you're in this picture." But the point I'm trying to make is at that thing they had like a kind of a holy card, but it was folded out about Saint Therese, and one of the things in it was in a picture that Saint Therese had drawn when she was a schoolgirl of the United States in her geography class, and it looked like a page that could have come out of a Waldorf book. So we look at what Steiner was doing in the 1920s, and to us it seems crazy. It's like but to his time it wasn't that much different from what was going on.
What do you mean by that? She drew a map that looked like it could have come out of a Waldorf book.
It was very colorful, done in colored pencils.
Yeah,
It looked almost the same kind of aesthetic that you see in a Waldorf made lesson book, which was extraordinary. I was like, and I told my wife, check it out. It's like the stuff I teach my kids in school.
Interesting.
So he wasn't trying to do anything he was trying to do something to fix what was there, but he wasn't trying to start from scratch. Mm-hmm. And as I said in our discussion of him a couple of weeks ago, I have to think that if we were to come to him and say, "Dr. Steiner, look at the world. What can we do for the children?" I'm sure he would come up with something very different right now.
Yeah, you said that. Interesting.
And that's why when I wrote Transfiguration, I proposed the idea of a hedge school, which is the idea of a hedge school comes from Ireland under British rule, and the Irish farmers and commoners did not want their kids learning British history, and having losing the Irish language. So they would hire what they call hedgerow teachers. They didn't teach in actual hedgerows. They taught in barns, but it was kind of clandestine and underground, right? And they would teach them all kinds of things. And not only would they teach them the 3 R's, but they might teach them, depending on where they lived, navigation, or there's a story I read in some account of it that I guess the school inspectors found out, and they were checking it out, and they were saying, "Well, what do they learn here?" Because they learn Latin and Greek. "Oh, they don't learn Latin and Greek." This boy whips out his Greek New Testament and starts reading it off fluently, and the the inspector's like, oh, well, not bad, I guess.
Well,
Not
isn't that the insight of Apollo Frere and Ivan Illich, their early work too, that, going to South America or wherever, you could teach reading in, say, 2 weeks when people wanted the skills, like if a vote was coming up or if it involved their own economic ventures, when it was desirable, these things that we just put kids in front of words for so many years,
Well,
that
it's so
when the timing is right,
inefficient.
how quick-
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, it's just putting kids on ice till mom and dad get off work.
Michael, I was wondering that part about the hedge school in Transfiguration, I loved that. I remember sitting right here, it was snowing, and I was just like, oh, this is great. I was so happy. I was jumping out of my seat. And I'm doing a podcast with the Doomer Optimism people. I don't know if you're familiar with their circle on Twitter. But they're asking questions about how do we school and community? How do we do these things? How do we rebuild sort of a parallel pulley? And if you were talking about a hedge school now, like is it coding? Like, is it planting? There are so many things that, like you say, we're teaching kids in school to waste time trying to learn learn letters when they're 5, when maybe they should be putting their hands in the dirt.
I think that's what I think one of the great things that Steiner made sure was part of the education were the practical arts, right? So kids can learn how to do actual things. And it surprises me how many of my college students don't know how to do so many things. Some of them do, but most of them don't know how to do it. They've been tracked already. By the time they get to 3rd grade, you'll be the artistic person. We're in a Waldorf school. Everybody plays music. Everybody knits. Everybody sews. Everybody does woodworking, right? Everybody does gardening. It's not special. It's not electives. Everybody does it. And what happens though, and this is why Steiner did that, is because one of the things he said, it's a moral failure if an adult doesn't know how to sew a button, right? But the reason he did that is because and you can see this, I've seen it many times. You give kids and I used to call it multiple avenues of access. So they have all these different ways to get into whatever it happens to be, whether they have an artistic way in, but you don't just give them that way. You give them all the ways in, and they might be stronger in one than another, but their strength in, say, it's artistic. Say you're teaching a history, and so they really get into drawing, copying like a fresco of Michelangelo into their main lesson book. And because they get a handle on that, they're more interested in the story. They're more interested in the reading and the writing, right? And in the science and on all kinds of it snowballs. And then what happens is when you go through a process like that, and it's not just in Waldorf education. But it should be in it. And this is what I think a homeschooling curriculum can offer with all those practical things. What happens is you end up with a human being who's not afraid of the world.
You've said that before. Because so important.
Because they have familiarity, which breeds confidence in all these different domains. And I had a boy. So I took this one class, 6th through 8th grade. They had kind of a teacher who was not cutting it, and she left. And they asked me to go in, and they were kind of, damaged by the time I got them. And I'm pretty laid back and funny, so they loosened up right away. And this one boy could barely read at the beginning of 6th grade. Where had he been in mainstream education, they would have tracked him to the dummy classes long since. But he just wasn't interested. But in 6th grade, he could barely read at the beginning. But I don't know what I did or what he did, or just it was just the time. He took off intellectually and with reading and stuff. By 8th grade, so it's only 2 years later, at 7th grade, I gave them an assignment. I said, I want you to read 3 books this summer. And when you come back, I'm going to give you a really kind of a cool assignment. You can do whatever you want. So when they came back, I gave them 3 choices. They could do a diorama, or they could do, I can't remember what the second one was, and the third one was, or they can make a movie, which was, this is the videotape days, right? So this kid did a movie of a short story by J.D. Salinger for Esme with Love and Squalor, which is a beautiful story. And it was hilarious, and it was beautifully done. And so, and then he just flowered in that 8th grade. And that actually later in 8th grade, he played Prospero in The Tempest when I directed the kids in The Tempest. But here's the thing: couldn't read in the beginning of 6th grade. He went to high school, in a public high school in the Detroit area. He got a summer job working at Greenfield Village, which is a kind of world attraction. And he was at lunch, and I guess he was 17 or 16. And he's talking to this woman who's probably in her 40s or 50s about art and literature and stuff. And she stopped him. She goes, "Where did you go to school?" She said, "I went to Detroit Waldorf School." "I want you to go home and thank your mother." And he ended up as the valedictorian of his class in high school, a kid who couldn't read at the beginning of 6th grade. So it just goes to show you that this business of tracking is poison. And the mainstream, as Tara was saying, where they have all these benchmark students will be able to do this at this point. In my experience, that's every kid is different.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And my own children, I had a couple of my kids who were not interested in reading until 6th grade. And what happens if you push the reading thing early grades, right? They burn out by 7th or 8th grade, and they don't want to read at all.
Speaking of 7th and 8th grade, here's a question for both of you. And I know, Souter, you've been working in schools as a teacher recently, so this might particularly kind of hit home. But I love thinking about the content of curriculums, and I love thinking about what we can do. And Martin's stories are very, very inspiring. Another question that I'm wrestling with is that despite the best laid plans of mice and men, we have a peer culture, a society maybe more dominated by age segregation, lack of intergenerational growth rituals, and immersion in social media peer culture than has ever maybe existed on the planet.
Yeah.
And so how, if we want to raise children who are engaging with the best content we can give them and self-educating, how do we face the fact that at the first confrontation, they might have incredible moral choices to make of being alienated from their peers or alienated from reality?
Let me think. Let me share a little bit like what I saw. So I was between jobs from say February through towards the end of the school year. And I thought, wow, I kind of want to see the school. So I chose a small district where my hope was I could see everything from K through 12, kind of near me. And it was great. There's some wonderful people there. There was a couple things that were really interesting, and I think I can get to some of this. What was new to me, and there's the special ed departments are huge now, right? They need them. The same guy from Harvard, this economist, I really believe he conjectured, like, if you gave every student a tutor, for 6 months, it wouldn't even begin to catch the damage. Just a side story of like the school closures. But there's a new phenomenon in schools. And I did run this by. I'd be in a classroom and there'd be like 2 special ed teachers and a teacher's aide, it's like a team. And so used to, when we were in schools, if we went to school, I went to Catholic schools and a public high school, you always had, I don't know if it was thirds, but you had a group of students who were kind of high performers, fair to middling. Those were me and my pals, and then some students who struggled. But coming out of COVID, and this was a school that never fully closed. There was a couple around us. but still enough people stayed home, and there was Zoom and everything for segments of the population. But I have a daughter who teaches in a nearby school district, another daughter who teaches in Astoria, Queens. And they said, no, this is true. And it was a change, is that in addition to those 3 levels, you have really nice kids, but there's a huge cadre in every single grade and in every single class who are not going to do anything. So you go through, as a substitute, you go in there and you say, oh gosh, the notes say that Hoozle, Fritz, and McGillicuddy are, missing 3 chapters. These people are missing none, and these people are missing 1. And then you have 2 or 3 kids who are missing like the whole book. And you're told by the special ed people to invite them, are you interested in doing something today? And they're always going to say no. And so talking to some special ed teachers that, there's this kind of black hole in every school district or school room now, that what does that do to the others when there's just a complete non-compliance? Do we call this part of the great refusal or the great resignation? I have no idea. Mm-hmm. But so I'm thinking of 1 in 6th grade, and I would say, and I won't give the student's name, like, where do you think, because I also can't say, wow, schooling is salvation, right? I really wish you'd apply yourself.
Right.
The other people in the school district, many of them, they have that belief. I don't have the faith, I guess. But I would still say, like, what do you think this is doing for you? And do you think you're going to change next year? Nope. To be honest, and maybe I'm getting too far afield, my youngest son, who's still in college, one of my 4, he goes the same things there in college. You can do nothing and pass. And he says it's ubiquitous across college campuses. And it's creating, Mike, your point about fear, it's creating massive anxiety. So people are drinking a heck of a lot more. Thoughts of suicide are ubiquitous, but also there's this great kind of like egregore we're building of just like maybe when the other shoe's going to drop. To your point, Tara, let me share one anecdote, and then we'll see if Michael or we can get something to get at your point, because I know you're probably more likely than us to actually be doing something, at least the 2 of us here, because you have young children. Peer groups. One anecdote I had was, that again, there's discipline problems that just can't be handled. Now, you've always had, the 6th grade is horrible. The 8th grade are kind of tryhards and do-gooders. But you always, at every school, I see you got to be mixing up. When Illich said you just have people of the same, he helped us capture the arbitrary nature of it, that you have kids of the same age in one classroom. And you start to see that that's just the greatest, craziest, when I mean greatest, I mean the greatest amount of insanity to a way of running a school district. So yeah, in school districts, including this one, you had where seniors might meet for lunch, twice a semester with some young struggling person. But the discipline problems were so bad that my last day there, I was and they can be so bad, like just F you, right?
I know.
And then, but one kid I met my first day, he was a senior, and I was walking out. It was my last day, and I knew it was the end of the school year, and there weren't going to be full subbing days anymore. We had 2 weeks left, and the teachers really have to be there. So I was called in for maybe a half a day, but they only needed me for a quarter of a day. And my last class of my last day there, I was in a class that, like many, was about to erupt. And I came out, and this nice senior, he said, and there was another sub who was going to have to handle that class. I think I was just going to be a teacher's aide that day. Remember, there's always a team. And I walked out, and this guy was walking down the hallway. So he goes, I don't know how people can handle them. He was a senior. And I just thought, like, these boys could handle them. The senior boys could be with them. They really could. And they could just handle them. My youngest son, he works at like a fun center up here. And he works, the go-karts and the laser tag thing at an outdoor fun center. And he's learned how to handle that demographic. But I thought that would be really good for those seniors. And they would know that they were needed. These senior boys who could just like lay down the law for these ones. I just saw a poetry that viscerally filled me with a better sense of beauty than some of these artificial pairings, which are still good, between a person in senior high checking in on a 2nd grader. Tell me what you think of that. They were so different from me. They look similar on the outside, that we can pair up before the school year starts, senior with a freshman, and help them get acclimated to this notion that you call in And this is one case because it could be females too. You could call in some senior boys who are, they had senioritis and everything. And I thought the blessings this team of young men could bring to this really good school district, but with some of the middle-aged school kids who are just completely and totally out of control.
I think that would be wonderful. And it's partly why I'm a big advocate for K through 8s.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of a middle school thing, having the 8th graders lead the kindergartners. But I would love to see what you're talking about with, seniors and freshmen, just having these older kids come in with them. The problem is that the administration is risk averse.
Completely.
They are afraid of someone saying something uncouth. They are afraid of someone getting, physical, even if they're going to get physical all the time anyway. Yeah. They are just by the book. And that's where, maybe there's been some good things from that, but that stranglehold of the administrative mindset on creativity is what's killing education. And we know that it's happening in a million ways, but what you're saying would be wonderful to, like, for a teacher to be able to say, I'm not going to treat you all as equal, but I know you and you would be really good at this.
Yeah.
Or maybe,
and that's the thing.
Yeah, haven't shown promise, but you would rise to the occasion. And so I'm going to give you the opportunity to see what happens. But the teachers,
these ones who could handle the 6th grade or the bad 8th grade class, they weren't always the best students, right? But it was such an important function they served because they were authentic and they could speak the same language. And it wasn't their way of being cool with these, the way I pictured it. And I know I was seeing it clearly. It would have drawn out the best in both. Very different than the summer. You have a 2-day training all my kids did when they were in senior class, the honor of taking this program where then they could welcome a freshman again, getting off the bus as a newbie and show them around, the actual directions to their locker. This was a wild pairing that could build relationship and it threatens this whole kind of class thing, this alchemical structure.
Relationships threaten administration. That's just how it is.
Right. And that's, and that, so my answer to that, I mean, that mentoring kind of thing is useful for sure. But now I'm not even advocating classrooms of the same grade, but one of the good things in the Waldorf education setting is because it's small is beautiful, and with the same teacher with the same kids for eight years, even if they have other kids come in, totally mitigates that cliquishness that you see in public schools, which are huge, because they're huge, and you need allies, you need friends, right? So the kids are drawn to the kids they think will not hate them as much as the other kids, right? That they're and so when I was a Waldorf teacher, say I had a girl come in 6th grade from public school, and she was coming in trying, I used to call them queen bees. She'd come in trying to set it all up, right? She's trying to arrange things, because she was used to this adversarial relationship between the students and the teacher. Mm-hmm. And she was trying to set that up with the other kids, and they're like, that's Mr. Martin. What are you talking about? He's one of us. He's out. So, and as Tara was just saying, relationship is the key. And that's what I always used to tell people when I was a Waldorf teacher. It's really about building relationships between the teacher and the students and each other, and all of this in the curriculum, right? And the world, which is the curriculum is the world. So that, and you'll still have, I wouldn't say cliquishness, but you'll still have, problems now and again, but it's much more human. And having homeschooled my own kids, in a kind of a one-room schoolhouse, there, people will say, what about socialization, right? Like, ever hear that when you're going to homeschool?
I got an anecdote on that in a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I always say, socialization to what? To what, right?
There's an
they're
anthropologist.
Totally socialized, and plus, I have read the Little House on the Prairie books a gazillion times to my children over the course of the years. what did they do about socialization?
Right.
Right. Or anybody. I mean, that's a myth, socialization. But it's a tool. Socialization is a tool of the archons.
Yeah, I was going to say, talk about appropriating like the language of your masters, because that is, we're not just making it up. We homeschooled our kids for a while, but like whether it was grandparents, uncles, or everybody, they're worried about socialization. But it's not a rebuttal like you would use it in an argument. But there's a very interesting, I forget if he's a sociologist or anthropologist, but his name is Lloyd DeMoss. You ever heard of him? Okay, but he, I always wondered if you had to compare cultures, which one is better than the other, right? You could have cultural relativism and everyone has to be judged on his own terms. But he looked at terms of empathic child rearing. He thought that would be progress from bundling kids, and just like exposing them. But when you looked at empathic child rearing, he said Jewish culture was an early empathic, like neat, right? And he just all these insights that came from that. But one of them, of course, was that socialization was a stage that should have been like 100 years ago. That's a stage in this hierarchy where you had like 6 to the half a dozen. We're treating every kid's like, just not individuals, but as just, units in a group. And, that when not homeschoolers, I'm not trying to give them a good headspace to be in when people say this, but sure, we can hear it as Michael was saying that like, socialization is like saying to be socialized into, like a gang, to be socialized into the kids who pick on other kids and things like that. But I forget what the higher level is called, but obviously it's the notion that everybody's unique and distinct and individuals.
Well, to be socialized into thinking you should change your gender at the age of 14, right?
Well, that brings up something that I would love to talk about in terms of these vulnerable groups. How do we build rituals for them? We've stripped rituals away. There's a few left in the Catholic Church for coming of age, but how this adolescent group is getting their rituals from social media and peer culture. Now, I've been reading a lot of Steiner, and this year for St. John's Day, I had my whole family come out and we jumped over the bonfire. And when Martin recommended the pouring of the apples, the apple juice on 12th night, we did that. But those are good family rituals. But how do we incorporate rituals for our older kids?
One be very short, that I used to work as a youth minister. Boy, I didn't ask for that job, but I had to do it. Really tough. But there was one book, and it was just a simple piece of advice that at least gets at some of this. But I used it for my own kids, that what people have to do is to delay certain coming of age passages. The point would be if you're a mother and you got your daughter's ears pierced at age 5, what is she going to do to break the rules when she's 13, right? And that we're doing those things that used to be those transgressive, setting up something mildly transgressive for an adolescent to do, to like say they're an individual, but we're giving them as gifts at 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old. So I think that's a little piece of it, but I have to think more.
Well, part of the problem is we live in a culture that treats children like adults and adults like children, right? You go in, I'll never forget when graphic novels first became a thing. This was back in the early 90s. I went to this video store. There's like an art, it had a lot of art films. I would go there, and they open up this graphic comic section, and I go home like, there's like all these guys my age reading comic books. What's with this? So it infantilizes our culture, infantilizes grown-ups, and treats kids like they're already adults. They like to make adult decisions. And Steiner is one of the things Steiner said, never do that, because what does it do? It makes the child anxious.
Yeah, you're bringing it all back to fear and anxiety, Michael. It's so crucial.
Yeah, and so when we're talking about socialization, for instance, I mean, well, there's socialization and there's rites of passage. So there's a really great book on education. It's called The Educated Mind by Kieran Egan. who's
Mhm.
an Irish educator who lives in Canada, and he's very he looks at the way we educate is three systems that are in conflict with each other. So you have socialization, which that's what's the goal there. It's to get us say the Pledge of Allegiance, go to the bathroom everybody goes to the bathroom at the same time. We're all in regimented groups, right? We know we learn American history or whatever the history is, and we learn and lately I think critical race theory is a socialization technique. It's
For sure it
not
is.
anything else. And then that's in conflict with self-expression, like a Rousseauian kind of approach to things,
Uh-huh.
finding, exploring the self. What do I like? Right. Well, how can you do socialization? How can you have a socialization model where you're also trying to teach a child to express himself?
So true.
Those they're in conflict with each other. And the other one is the kind of Platonic model where you learn all this, high knowledge with the goal of being kind of liberated in your thinking. Well, you can't be a clear individual thinker and also be socialized to the system, right?
Could we
And
agree that like those second two options are both flotsam and jetsam on the socialization though, like in institutional schooling? Is that right? Would you agree? Like they're window
I,
dressing.
institutional schooling
It's
is
language
almost entirely
socialization.
socialization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think grooming is socialization.
Yeah.
Um, but and so homes are unschooling is really Rousseauian, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, so what do you want to do today? What do you want to learn about today,
And
Jimmy?
great books theoretically could be this kind of elite thing.
That is
But
great. The great
when
books is the Platonic
the
thing, right?
medium being the message, so if you have an overt lesson of some socialization in the medium of schooling, and Michael was making the point of you have socialization. Tara had to step away for a little bit. You have socialization claims in a school, but also finding yourself and also like elite knowledge. I guess and they can't work, so that's a condemnation. But also, I think the system is so bright that the top two are just lures and frosting in
Yeah.
a massive socialization campaign. This was John Taylor Gatto's main point.
Oh yeah, he was awesome. Yeah. And he knew because he had been a teacher in the system, right? He knew how jacked up it is. Now, interesting. Now, in Egan's book, he says instead of doing those three things, why don't we try to do, where the child is at the time? So he has these different types of understanding. So he, like for an infant, for instance, he calls somatic understanding. So they learn things kind of by touch, and warmth, and feel, and then when they get a little older, he calls it mythic understanding. So children, like first, second, third, fourth grade, they're interested in myth, but also the use of fairy tales. A great book by Bruno Beetlheim, The Uses of Enchantment, right? Steiner schools are big on fairy tales and saint stories in those early grades. And then Egan goes from there to romantic understanding, which, where kids are interested. Remember when I was a kid, probably you too, Mike, I remember in the library, everybody was gathered around the Guinness Book of World Records.
And
right?
And like books about Bigfoot and
Yeah,
mysteries. Yeah.
because this is what he says is that
always taking out dinosaurs and books on Bigfoot.
Right, because students are interested in what's possible.
Yeah.
Can you actually have 3 legs and walk around and have a career? Can Siamese twins get married?
Did you guys do the same thing with comic books? Because I remember all
comic books are the same kind of thing, right?
Being with comic book cards, but that seems to have really replaced fairy tales for my kids' ears. Like when
comic book cards.
We did with comic book cards, but obviously the movies and the culture, like when kids' friends come over, that's sort of
and that's unfortunate too.
And I think that's weird that they've lost sort of what I see as the archetypal fairy tales and are getting these sort of superhero.
Yeah, which is why Steiner said don't have a TV, right? Right. And then so Romantic Understanding, a great book that it really illustrates that, is Anne of Green Gables.
Yes.
Lucy Maud Montgomery, she was a school teacher, and she really knows she really captures what kids in 7th and 8th grade are like, right? They have that and I love that scene in Anne of Green Gables when Anne and Diana are performing the Lily Maid from Tennyson, and she gets the boat launches down the river, and she goes down the river pretending she's the Lady of Shalott, which is great. But her love for language, right? My one daughter was basically the reincarnation of Anne when she was little. I mean, she was really interested in big words, and she would spit them out all the time, and she'd say, and one great thing, Anne would say, "I'll stay here because there's more scope for imagination." And then after that, so that goes probably till 10th grade, and then kids, Egan would say, move into what he would call philosophic understanding. So they're trying to find a way to understand the world. So you have, a 16-year-old girl, I'm a feminist, and they see everything through that lens. You say, like, pizza, that's
age appropriately.
That's patriarchy. Yeah. You know what I mean? Or whatever. Or a kid thinks he's a socialist when he's 17. But what happens is a teacher or a parent, you don't discourage them, but what happens is that you start to, so what about this?
Tara, what do you think? So you're at home. Yeah. And then, so, I have a sense here, that, again, my kids had spent some time in public school. We homeschooled, then they went to a small Catholic school, which, I'll be honest, I liked more because it was small than because it was Catholic. The Catholic thing was fine. And this happened to be a good one. In one sense, they had a healthy arts kind of integration. But Tara, tell for the listeners too, like, where are you now? What are you doing? And you even mentioned forest school. I think we'll bring it back. And then, Michael, like, if you had to create a school right now, I've given some thought to what I would do if I had to offer something. If they came to you, said 5 families come to you and say, Tara, help us.
I was asked years ago to start a neighborhood co-op when I didn't have any kids. And I said, oh, absolutely not. Because my values and imaginations were very outside of what theirs were. I've been reading about homeschooling for many years. I right now have 2 who are home full-time. My older 2 are in a school.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my preference, but at the moment it's a Lutheran school that was recommended to me by a friend, and I went to visit it, and I was pretty critical after having worked in some Catholic schools, and I loved it. It's in the middle of a rural country, and I go to their
families are involved, I presume.
I go to every little thing they have, and I'm shocked at how they keep managing to navigate everything beautifully. There's no screens in the classrooms. They were quick to get rid of masks. They stayed open during COVID. There's this wonderful sense of being out in nature. It's just surrounded by, it's farmer kids. It's just kind of rural farmer kids and my kids. I don't want to stay with it forever, but I do love that my kids, I'm not from Western Pennsylvania, so I know very few people in this very.
Where are you from?
Oh, nowhere.
Okay,
I'm from like the New York suburbs and the DC suburbs.
Cool.
So it's places with high turnover and just not very rooted. So this is a very rooted place. Anywhere we go, everybody knows everybody's uncle and cousin, and that's hard. So the school has been good in having my kids feel a part of a community, which is something I never had as a public school student. I would like to get them home soon, but in the meantime, it's working well. In the summer, we're doing this forest school where you bring them down into the woods and they just go crazy. So they come home and they're dirty and they're messy, and that's kind of what I'm going for every day. There's a Waldorf school in Pittsburgh, which is insanely expensive.
Actually, the boy I talked about who was the valedictorian of his class,
Mhm.
He taught there for a while.
Oh,
The
and
Waldorf,
Yeah.
I know one of the teachers. I know some of the people who go there. I think it would be marvelous if I
Do
could.
you think it's a good one? When Michael and I talked about Rudolf Steiner, we had we have to admit a lot of them are really whacked out, filled with kind of elitist sensibilities, ashamed of Rudolf Steiner in a sense.
I've gotten that sense from a lot of other schools. I'm not very close to this school, but the one teacher who I knew very well was nothing like that. He was
Cool.
he was one of the big influences in getting me to go back to Steiner and read more. And
What was his name?
his name is Bob.
Bob.
I started a book club
Okay.
for Inklings, and he came.
You should spell it backwards for Michael so we hide his true identity.
I won't give his last name, but his name's Bob, and he was wonderful. I always always wish he would come back to book club, but I don't think we were Steinerian enough for him back then. But I mean, they had a book club at the school that would read Steiner every Wednesday.
Wow.
And they spent 2 hours talking about Steiner. So I think that was helpful. So I have high opinions of the school. It's just, it's out of our
It's outrageously expensive. Yeah.
It's insane.
I've often thought that, I live in the country. There's a small little Catholic school. Again, my kids went to public school all of them were there from say 5th grade through 12th. But there was a small little Catholic school that was always for a while on the verge of closing. And having worked in almost every possible ministry within the Catholic Church, if it closed, I was always trying to tell people that, okay, that's fine. Now, that whole entity walks out, the school, and we could take the building and just do it from the bottom up. That this would be kind of Illich, that when enough parents, kids are constantly learning stuff just by being alive. But when enough kids, their parents wanted to tackle something like Spanish, I work at a college, I could get a good Spanish educator. They're right here. And we could stipend that teacher to go in and do 12 weeks, and 12 weeks again. And so from the bottom up pay, we didn't need a computer lab. We don't want many computers, but everybody has one at home. So we don't need to do that. Phys ed, we're not going to hire a gym teacher, but we can, I think there is some really good instruction that comes from phys ed. I don't want to diminish that, but everything kind of from the bottom up. And then when people, when parents just choose that they wanted to organize for this. And I know some people who drive into Rochester who they just pay like $200 for a course. They agree that they want this and they all have a community and somebody teaches it. But this bottom up, there's so much freedom for people. It doesn't cost
That's
anything.
happening all over the Pittsburgh area.
Okay, it's
It's
great.
especially happening on the north side. It's happening in some of the small towns. I live in a very bad area for it in terms of its deindustrialization progress, but it is happening.
I'm not seeing enough of it. And maybe it's because I was in a school and my kids are out of school age.
I'm not seeing enough, but I am in like a moms of preschoolers group where they're like trying to get there. So there are people working for it, but there's every year things happen, but it's like waiting for spring to come. You see one fly and then
parents
another.
have kids in school that they're hating it. And I want to say, like, you can just walk out into freedom, right? They go, what do we do? I go, the first thing you do is you grab your kids, you just walk out. My friend Bill Kaufman, who Tara, he lives in a small town, so we had nothing wrong with the school, but it was just another approach that we have to drop the religious nature of the schools. That's the biggie. The schools exist more in our mind than they do in reality. Again, like with COVID, people, Michael, you said they saw on Zoom what was going on. So that was the first great illusion they saw behind the curtain. But Bill Kaufman's approach was on any given day, and I admit we did a lot of this. My daughter Lucy took off Wednesdays for until she was a freshman in college. And she would just do something else. But any holiday, remote holiday, the birthday or Sojourner Truth, that was a day to stay home and travel to something or do, that she was technically enrolled, but you can really kind of push this stuff, I guess, until high school, and they start kind of like calling on you. But, people just need to, I think it's the first step is just to not take it so seriously.
Right.
I've never checked. I was at a lacrosse game once, and I guess all the boys in my youngest son's grades, they were worried about a test that they all thought they had failed. And a parent asked me, and I think he was a junior at that point, to be honest with you. And my youngest was a junior, and I said, how do you guys know the grade? And they said, oh, it's on a thing called School Tools. And I'm just not lying with God as my witness. I said, I don't even know what school tools is. Like, how do you not know? Like most parents are checking all the time. And I could see that your child knows you're checking that all the time and it's downloading fear into them. I should be embarrassed that I didn't even know it existed, that I could check out my child apart from the report cards that came that had any access. I guess I wasn't interested, you know?
But one of the things that because I think about this a lot, and people don't know how incredibly inefficient schooling is. I mean, even in the best situation, it's just so damned inefficient. And my kids, with their, I mean, they do so little, and but they're done before lunch usually. And usually Bonnie, with the two younger ones, she'll do math with them after lunch for an hour. Just because you do need to practice that kind of stuff. But, I think a great example is Beatrix Potter, who just studied at home with a tutor, didn't do much, but she was highly educated, never went to college, but she was publishing scientific papers when she was 18, because she was so that time. I mean, they really allowed children to observe nature, and which is why her illustrations in her books look like actual nature, and not like you can compare the illustrations in a Beatrix Potter book to some of the lousy illustrations that people treat kids like they're idiots. The children's books that have these horrible images with these loud colors, and whether they're computer generated or not, they're just damned ugly, which is why Steiner said, surround the child with beauty, right? And it doesn't have to be expensive to be beautiful.
Tara has a PhD in this type of stuff, basically.
Well, I mean, it's just
Dalai
amazing.
Lama of illustrations in children's books.
It's just amazing that people think you need to you keep kids busy with all this garbage, like Guido was saying. I just feel like my head is just filled with crap.
Ballast,
and it doesn't need to be like that. So for other people who are listening, you might want to check out the Charlotte Mason's stuff, which is really based on education in nature, which is really useful. I mean, Bonnie uses that to a certain degree, not a lot, but there are all kinds of things. This is why when I taught a course for people who were actually in the classroom, and I made them read Anne of Green Gables, because if you want to be a good teacher, they got to know what kids are like, Go ahead.
I think there's sort of two things against us in terms of getting kids to be immersed in beauty. And one of them is the cult of newness. Teachers are pushed by corporations and they're pushed by other parents to do something that's new.
And family, yeah.
I mean, like, when if my kids are watching TV, there's an ad for the new movie. This is new, you have to watch it. And there's this weird cultural bias in not sharing things with your own kids, like as if people are ashamed of saying the old Mr. Rogers episodes are better than Daniel Tiger because it's not new. And it's okay that I understand that the whole for-profit media is going to be pushing that, but for parents to buy into that and want to compete with their child and say, let's watch Minions rather than Pollyanna, it's breaking that bond of what the kid and the parents have both grown up with.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, for me, I mean, it can be daunting and overwhelming to like, well, how are you going to change everything? Well, slow and steady wins the race, right? So start small is beautiful. Small is where you start, and whether it's with your own kids or whether what you're building up, in fact, I know a friend of mine got very disappointed in their Waldorf school, actually the place where I used to teach, because they were wearing masks and they were doing all this crazy stuff, and she was totally not into it. And so what they did, a lot of the parents yanked their kids out of the school because they did not want, in fact, I think they're thinking about wearing masks again this year.
It's knocking on the
Insane.
door in a lot of places. Yeah.
And so what they did, actually, they hired, actually, I was going to say this kid, he's probably 35, but when he was a kid, I taught him. He wasn't in my class, but I taught him in some classes. And he took on, they had like 7 kids who were about second or third grade, and they hired him to be their teacher. And they're doing a hedge school, and they meet 2 or 3 days a week, and he goes through basically the Waldorf curriculum with the kids, and like a main lesson, and then they have other things. My own kids, I have 3 in school still. My daughter will be a senior, an 8th grade boy and a 6th grade boy, and we think, now they got the curriculum down. I mean, they also play basketball in the league, but we're thinking about, going back to what Tara said earlier about initiation rituals for our 13-year-old to learn blacksmithing, because there are some blacksmiths who actually give lessons in the vicinity over here, because I think, for a boy anyway, it might be different for girls, but for a boy, I think very often at that age, that age of initiation, this is in African cultures, for instance, this is when you have to go kill a lion or something, right? So or they're circumcised. That'll make you realize you've been initiated into a new stage of life. But and I had this happen when I was a school teacher. I had a boy, really talented boy, but really super whiny and clingy. And I'd give an algebra problem, and he just, I can't do it. I'm like, you're driving me nuts. Okay. And so we're talking. We had, in fact, one of my best friends now, she was basically the special ed teacher of the school. And so I met with her and some other teachers, and I said, what does this boy need? And I said, he needs something so archetypally male that he could hurt himself, whether like hunting or trapping or some blacksmithing. And it just so happened that one of the other teachers, her son, was a blacksmith. And so they got some funding, and the blacksmith would come every Friday afternoon, and this boy would take off of 1 period or 2 periods and go learn blacksmithing. And then he burned himself. And because I wanted him to have to do something, if he wasn't paying attention, he would burn himself. And then he was applying to college, and he had to write a letter, and he told me about this. He said, they ask you, what is something that transformed you felt transformative? Because that, he wrote about that. Because I really felt that after that, I was a different person. And here's a great thing. I ended up teaching him in college too, which was for both of us. It was, I was really loved this kid. And I was teaching philosophy at Mary Grove College, and he walks in, and he looked at me and said, we're back together. And he was so much more capable than everybody else there. I mean, not just because I had been his teacher, but just because who he was and his willingness to engage the world,
Right.
Which was great. I mean, it's inspiring.
Tell us some more things, Tara. You're writing notes. I see that.
Oh no, I was so inspired by his blacksmithing story. I had a friend who got very into blacksmithing in high school, and he made a name for himself by wearing like an iron dress to prom. That's his career now.
Yeah.
And when I think about my son and things I want him to do in the world that are good and not evil,
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about blacksmithing in a very long time. But I was okay. That's something to put on the table again. Those things where we make things with our hands and engage with the world and have to learn to bend to reality or bend with reality.
Yeah, and Michael's mentioned fear and anxiety so many times, and each time I've tried to highlight it. But like, if we if we can't get the money for those things in school, for this idea of helping people moving through adolescence or anything, we can put them there as the antidote to, anxiety, the epidemic, because everybody
Well-
understands that. To say, instead of like all this counseling, which is again prudent and useful, but just put it in front of people that without this, your kid's going to be a nervous, anxious wreck.
Right. And that's part
That's
of
that's the sell.
making them adults before what do you want to wear today, Jeffy? What do you want to eat? How many decisions do you make before breakfast? Right.
Mhm.
But then, and that creates anxiety.
Yeah.
And they get corrected one time by an adult and they have a meltdown. Right.
Mhm.
But the other thing with what talk about blacksmithing or whatever it is in woodworking, I think was a great example of this in a Waldorf curriculum, gardening, or, part of engaging with the world is that it pushes back, right?
Mhm.
It pushes back at you. And I my sense from the college students I get is that a lot of them don't get, they go, okay, then what would you like? They don't get the world to push back. And it's not just pushing back materially, but intellectually. No one gets pushed back. No one, and that's part of, we know this. That's part of what strengthens a person's ego, strengthens a person's self, is when you get, and I don't mean criticism or anything like that. I mean, just bringing it up anomaly. Say you have a 16-year-old feminist, right? I said, well, and I had this happen with a 19-year-old feminist last semester when she told me she was doing a paper on feminism. And I asked her in the question, she had to do a presentation, and I said the question and answer. I said, so there's a lot of talk these days about trans women. How do they fit into the feminist framework? Are they really women? She said, yeah, they really are. I said, well, what if they want to detransition? Which is just bringing it up, and okay. I mean, and it's not being mean. It's an actual. What do you do with that? Right. And then what happens is, and the reason you do that as a teacher is not to attack the student. And if you do it as an attack, it's going to backfire. But you just raise that and let them think about it. They don't have to. It's not like an arm wrestling match where they have to say uncle.
Mhm.
Well, I think, that's one of the getting students to really dig into the mysteries. You said the world pushes back. And I think also creating a mystery. If we're trying to build rituals, you also want to create a mystery. That's part of the ancient mystery schools, is the Zen koan, the having to engage with something and your teacher just doesn't tell you the answer.
Yep.
And we have all the kids who are living in a social media environment which has dissolved time and is dissolving space.
Mhm.
And one way our family's trying to deal with that is for us to be making our own calendar. I'm making my own calendar with our major solstices and equinoxes, then also going into the quarter days, Lammas and May Day, and it makes me dig. I have to have my kids dig. I say, what does it mean to have All Hallows Tide? You've learned about Halloween. You've gone to Target, you see the Halloween decorations. Let's dig and figure out what All Hallows Tide is. And for these kids who have these pat answers about what their gender is, to have to maybe go dig into the experience of, okay, I'm not going to tell you that's not true, but why don't you dig into what childbirth was in the year 1100
Mhm.
and come back and sort of tell me what that female experience is? They might have a very different view than just the talking points they've learned on Tumblr.
Great, great, great. We're winding down a little bit. I'll share that tomorrow I have lunch with, how if we went to college, you had to pay these student association fees, for the clubs and things. The vice president of Student Life, where I work, he was saying that the students have been so frugal with those monies that the account has millions of dollars in it, right? And they're trying to say it's a state school, they better start using it, or they could possibly lose some of it to the state. But at lunch, there's two things. I'm trying to say, I work in a building that's technically off campus, so they could have events here where instead of using school food, they could have, catered. So there's some draw to it. But also, I've said a prayer for a couple of days in a row that this student, I want to say, couldn't you, we've said a lot about these activities. It could be canning. It could be blacksmithing. They have so much money they could be bringing in and using this building, or who knows, I don't care which building they use, to set up their own parallel pole, in school. I wish me luck. But, there's on the other side, I have to battle with like a board that wants to say, we want to tell them what to take. And my own 4 kids are saying they need to steer their own ship. They need to say these things they want. We can't say it's prudent, but it's not the final good to say we're hosting, 2 old ladies from church are going to be teaching knitting on a Tuesday night. We need the young people to like say what they want. Then the adults can help them get that, but I think it's out there, but tomorrow will be like lesson number 500 is if I need it, on how we can, and I have 4 young kids. Mike, you have kids. Terry, you have kids. But sometimes making these connections, I want to say you have millions of dollars at your disposal. There's an anxiety epidemic. You could, and you have, despite the world telling you you're so busy in college, you don't even have to go to class anymore and you can pass. Like, you could be doing something really neat here. So say a prayer for me too.
Yeah,
right?
I'll do.
Yeah. So again, Tara, we'll put you on the spot. You're willing to keep on joining us on a somewhat regular basis, I hope. You're a gem.
Oh, thank you so much. No, it's so pleasant to listen to both of you talk. I feel a little embarrassed because my oldest child is 6.
Oh, wow.
Really, I'm learning from you as I go, and it gives me an excuse to listen to the podcast. So
I wish I could be one of your children. You got so many ideas. Well, thank you again, Tara.
I want to end with an anecdote.
Do it.
Now, I heard this story. It was really useful for me. I was at a conference, and this guy, he was a psychologist. He taught at Princeton. He was a big, famous guy. I can't remember his name. Robert Young, maybe. And he said a couple of things. He said, he was talk to us as teachers. He said, teaching is one of the only jobs still important enough to be called a vocation, right?
Cool.
Which is true. He said, and I'm sure a lot of you just missed walking into the seminary or the convent on your way to teaching, because it's really one of the only jobs still important enough to be called a vocation. But the other thing he said, you got to give yourself some space, because we're so uptight about things and in raising our children and raising our students. And he told the story that when he was in graduate school, the grad students were meeting at the professor's house, and it was summer. And he's, his wife let them in. They're waiting in the lobby or whatever room it was, and he hears all this footsteps upstairs. And then he hears voices. Then he hears this eminent Princeton psychologist yell out, "Because I'm your goddamn father, that's why." And then he comes down the stairs, and the students are all waiting for him to be embarrassed, and he wasn't embarrassed. He said, "No, what? They can handle it. Let's start talking about child psychology."
That's great.
And and I think if he were to tell that story at a conference now, you'd have to have oxygen tents outside of the conference room, because people would be traumatized. But it's the truth. I mean, I have 9 kids, and teaching boys, I'm sorry, is different from teaching girls.
Mm-hmm.
It's so different.
Yeah.
My students used to tease me. The boys would come up with me, and these 2 boys, they'd come up every couple of months and say, "Okay, Mr. Martin, we have to know." I said, "What? Who's better, Batman or Superman?" Batman doesn't have all the superpowers. You got to figure things out. I'm going to go with Batman. I told you, man. I told you. But these same boys, I said, "Well, you idiots, just cut it out." They'd be goofing around, and they would come to me at recess. Goes, "How come you're always calling us idiots?" I goes, "I don't know." Because what do you mean? Goes, "Well, when you say to the girls, they say, 'Oh, thanks, honey. Thank you, sweetie.'" I said, "Well, they are sweet and honey, like honey, and you guys are idiots."
Yeah.
and that was cool with it. I mean, that's the thing, is it's different teaching boys than teaching girls.
I told you, a priest I
No?
just had dinner with tonight, brightest guy I've ever met, the brightest person he ever met when he was sent over to study at the highest levels in the Catholic Church at Rome, said no civilization has survived 3 generations of co-education. That phrase, it has a
Interesting.
cadence to it. And I've always kept it because it sounds funny, right? No civilization has survived 3 generations of co-education. But again, when we water it down, the kind of the yin yang, the polarity that generates creativity is gone. And as Michael's saying, it's just kind of different there. And
Oh.
none of us are trying to say we have to force women into a box. But what are we giving up when we lose that engine generator is something we'll have to talk about. Yeah.
That's a whole other podcast.
It really is.
50 things sprouting up.
Hey, Tara, give us a name for it. So we'll do it the next time you're on. Would we just talk about gender? Do you want to?
I would just call it 3 generations, and let's talk about what happens when you have generational unisex ideology.
3 generations
of unisex ideology. I mean, I went to a all women's college for a semester, and it was a life-changing experience.
Huh. Okay.
Do that.
3 generations of unisex education. Next time we get to have Tara Thieke on the Regeneration podcast. We want to thank everybody for listening. Find us on YouTube or at Podbean, Spotify, and other wonderful places like that. Have a good week.
You too.
Yep. Take care.
Bye, everybody.